Welcome everyone to West Africa Com and to the session, Teachers Are Great Telecom Customers. My name is Jim Teicher, founder of the online learning enterprise Cybersmart Africa, and we're talking about what we can do now to help teachers benefit even more from connectivity. My experiences include a variety of roles in telecom product development, digital financial services, and innovative digital learning solutions for massive scale. And joining me is Dr. Momar Dieng. And Dr. Dieng has deep experiences covering vast areas of the digital learning space. Momar served as Senior Technical Policy Advisor to the Senegalese Minister of Education, driving the technology transformation of the nation's education system. He has also been an advisor to the World Bank and continually works as a preeminent leader to bring practical digital learning to West Africa. Welcome, Momar.
Thank you very much, Jim. It's a pleasure to be with you. Hello to all of our viewers, and it's an honor to be part of West Africa Telecom Conference.
So let's get started. Now, during the pandemic, we've seen a variety of attempts by ministries of education to encourage digital learning from home or to watch lessons broadcast on TV. I'd imagine that the pandemic has widened the gap between the digital haves and the digital have-nots.
Absolutely, Jim. The pandemic has really wreaked havoc on the education systems across the region. In my recent work surveying countries all the way from Senegal to DRC in Central Africa, I found that the pandemic has really caught most ministries of education unprepared to deal with what would be required to put in place contingency measures in order to keep students on track with their learning and to support teachers. If I can just give you a little bit of background on the region, if you take three of the most populated countries in Africa, Nigeria, Ethiopia, and the DRC, their access to electricity stand at roughly 57, 50, and 90%. For those three. So that leaves about 175 million people without access to electricity. So it's hard to talk about digital learning if you don't even have electricity. If we think about access to internet, only 1 in 4 people in sub-Saharan Africa have access to internet. So it's clear that this pandemic has hit very hard where it hurts most in terms of education and learning. Learning losses will really be extremely deep, and those will in turn exacerbate inequality. Most surveys show that you have very different levels of access to distance learning, to parental support for learning at home, to time spent studying while schools are closed, and these are all a function of socioeconomic background, right? We already had a lot of children out of school, roughly 268 million globally, or children globally are out of school, and millions will be added to that because they will not be able to return to school after the pandemic.
But still, I believe there is a bright side in terms of the telecom ecosystem and teachers' participation in connectivity. I'd like to share some data about teacher connectivity. Several months ago, Cybersmart Africa conducted a survey of 300 new teachers graduating from teacher training colleges in Senegal. I don't think anyone has ever before talked specifically to teachers about their digital life. The top takeaway is that teachers are very important customers. They represent the largest professional workforce of regularly paid civil servants in West Africa, and they can drive children and families to connect. Although most teachers don't have a fixed internet connection at home, they do pay to go online. Most buy monthly internet passes, and they pay from $2 to $10 a month, the equivalent of maybe about $5 on average. Still, teachers spend a greater percentage of their monthly income on connectivity than in Asia and in the Americas. And we need to figure out how to make connectivity much more affordable here in West Africa. By far, teachers prefer connecting with a smartphone compared to other devices. In fact, 89% of new teachers own a smartphone. And by the way, West Africa depends heavily on these new teachers who serve a rapidly growing student population. But they need much more support finding and using learning content, particularly in support of the curriculum. For example, look at the picture on the right. How can schools participate in a globalized world if teachers draw maps with chalk on a board like you see here on the right, when the real maps, let's say Google Maps, are available in seconds? So Momar, what about giving away phones or connectivity to all of these connected teachers? Telecoms have given away so much already. Is this the best strategy?
Well, Jim, of course, EdTech is predicated on, usually predicated on owning a device, be it a smartphone, a tablet, a computer, or even a feature phone, right? EdTech doesn't have to be high-tech, it needs to use some form of technology. So it's easy to think that the best strategy would be for governments or industry, outside partners, to just distribute devices, since that seems to be one of the barriers to entry in terms of the use of EdTech. However, the best evidence we have up to now, doesn't really support that strategy. Some of the biggest programs that we have that were evaluated are some of these one laptop per child initiatives that were carried in Latin American countries, in countries like Uruguay or Colombia, and the evidence has been extremely disappointing. So access to hardware is probably necessary for access to software and other EdTech tools. However, it's not sufficient, and giving access to hardware just by distributing devices certainly is not going to be the most cost-effective way or the best use of public or private money for that matter.
So do you believe that teachers should buy their own phones, or there should be certain incentives, but maybe there is less value in something if it's just given away for free?
Absolutely. I believe that that's what the evidence shows, and it's consistent with, frankly, what we know about just the behavioral science and economic theory. I believe that this is one area where practitioners and governments need to believe in the power of markets. Now, of course, in poor countries, teachers will not usually be able to afford devices at market prices. If we just let them try to buy those devices alone. So I do believe that some of these programs or some of these initiatives need to involve some kind of subsidy, incentives, both from government and from private partners, such as the telecom companies, but it still needs to work within the overall framework of a market-based strategy where individuals and users are allowed to buy their own devices and maintain them. I think that's the only way to go. And the evidence has shown that.
There have been so many pilots of educational technologies in West Africa. So how do the ministries track and maximize the donations and the values gained from these pilots so that they're not reinventing the wheel?
Well, I'm glad that you're asking me this question after I've left the ministry, because had I still been a government official, I would have had to give you the company line and come up with some political spiel about how everything is rosy. But the truth, Jim, is that governments don't track any of these donations and can't, in fact. Just the way government processes work just doesn't lend itself to those kinds of influxes of donations of equipment. The way it's done usually actually reinforces really nefarious practices, if I can put it that way. It reinforces ways of dealing with procurement and with distribution of equipment that usually don't target the people who need it the most. And the other aspect of it is, of course, that over time, it's very difficult to figure out where that equipment really went. I can give you many examples of projects within the education ministry where I worked, where after 12 to 18 months, we could not tell you exactly where the devices went, either because there was a lot of leakage or because there was, frankly, not enough thought put into the process of maintenance and what would happen if some of these devices broke, for instance, or were stolen. And the devices themselves usually were not always picked in order to be able to withhold the ruggedness of the environment, right? So most of the school environments in sub-Saharan Africa are not these sanitized environments where you can easily be able to keep these devices protected away from dust, from other environmental factors that make their lifespan much shorter than it would be in an ideal environment. So there's a host of reasons why these equipment donation programs don't work. And I have to go back to the earlier point that, in terms of economics, in terms of behavioral science, it only makes sense really if the end users has some skin in the game, has some stake in it, and is more incentivized to take better care of the equipment.
So let's talk about maybe a couple projects quickly that have been particularly challenged based on your observations. I know originally there was this huge NAPAD project, and there have been many others.
True. So the NAPAD project is an important one. It started in the early 2000s as the African Union was also, trying to finalize an education strategy, and they immediately identified EdTech as one of the pillars of that education strategy. So the aim was to provide computers, internet access, and other ICT to all schools in Africa within 10 years. That was the stated goal, right, under the NAPAD agreement. Now, the main goal, of course, behind that, the logic behind that was to expand students' ability to learn in schools through their internet connection and through technology access, and to have access to digital resources, to software, to smart curricula, and so on and so forth. Now, as I told you, the aim was to cover all high schools in Africa within 5 years. If you think about it, that sounds pretty, all high schools within 5 years and all primary schools within 10 years. That sounds pretty ambitious, and it's no surprise that that goal was never reached. It started in 2003. We are 17 years later. I think that we're extremely far from that original goal. In Senegal, for instance, we had a project called Ressources Numériques, which would translate in English to digital resources, right? E-resources, which aimed at producing video content of lessons and distributing those via CDs or flash drives to teachers. And the goal behind that was to also provide a backup solutions in case of strikes, so that, especially for students who were in exam years, they would have access to the materials even if the teachers were on strike. Those programs also suffered from the basic fact that an education ministry is not a content provider. And I think that this is one thing that is important to keep in mind going forward. The ecosystem, the know-how, the tools and resources that you would need to cover all the different aspects that would go into producing quality educational content usually just are not available in any education ministry for that fact. It's not just in developing countries. I could say the same thing for more advanced countries like the US, right? So this is not an indictment of African countries. It's just that the government processes and the way ministries work doesn't lend itself well to doing that kind of work, and this is where private sector, I believe, and telecom companies, for instance, need to step in.
So, what is your message for the private sector that may have seen more projects than they would like go into a black hole without results? What are the core elements that they need to have in terms of their eyes wide open in order to have successful educational technology projects?
The two key words for me are scalability and sustainability. I think that many of these projects end up being projects where it's about cutting the ribbon, it's about distributing, it's about handouts, right? And that doesn't really favor scalability or sustainability. I believe that, especially for telecom companies, what is needed is a deeper understanding of the ecosystem and the environment. And a good way to do that actually is the survey that you share. The kind of research that you share is really critical to really understand what the stakeholders, such as teachers, really need in terms of access to internet, in terms of productivity tools, in terms of tools to support their classroom and teaching practices.
I know you talk a lot about STEM.
I am very partial to STEM, being a mathematician by training. I do believe that solid grounding in math and science from a very early age, I wouldn't even say primary school, I would go even to kindergarten level, is extremely important if we want the kind of economic growth and the kind of development that we all hope for sub-Saharan Africa. It will start in education, and within education, it will have to start with improving STEM education. To get too focused on hardware and connectivity and forget that at the end of the day, hardware and connectivity are of no use if you don't have content. Now, I do realize that telecom companies are not in the business of creating content, but they can at least use some of the market power that they have and the networks that they have to bring to the table content editors and other players.
And of course, there's the world of educational publishers and the hundreds and hundreds of universities with EdTech graduate programs. So I don't believe there is a shortage in finding content if you go look for it. There are incredible opportunities, Momar, for new educational services that leverage the capacity of telecom players in so many ways. So do you have some closing remarks to wrap up our conversation?
Well, first of all, thank you very much for this opportunity. I think that in closing, I would just add maybe that going forward, it's important to make sure that in the COVID crisis that we're living right now, we pay attention to tools that can be used at home, right? We are thinking a lot about bringing back students to the classroom, but we don't know when and if that's going to be done successfully. So we need to start supporting parents, right? Which is another maybe constituency we haven't talked about right now. I know being a parent myself that it's very hard on parents right now to try to be both a parent and a teacher, and many of them were not prepared to play that role.
And this, of course, brings up the affordability of connectivity issue again. which we're going to have to figure out somehow or other.
Absolutely, yes.
So thank you so much, Dr. Momar Dieng, and thanks to everyone for joining us at West Africa Com.
Thank you very much, Jim.